Okay, so we are now out to YouTube. Uh, we'll ask people to unmute themselves as they speak. As we begin the meeting, though, I am going to put people on mute. And so those who will be speaking, we'll invite you to unmute as we go forward. I thank everyone for joining us this morning, and we really have a great program ahead of us over the course of this coming hour. And this is really extraordinary in that APAC is coming to us. What has been in the past has been we've gone to APAC. It's well over a decade. I think it's about a dozen years that our congregation has each year sent a delegation to APAC. And as an example of that, I just wanted to screen share one photo from one of many, many photos. This is a photo from last year when we were with Congresswoman Hayes. And every year we have a delegation which goes, and it's always such an informative and uplifting experience. For me personally, the best part of the APAC experience has been the depth of learning that I and that members of our congregation get from the programs and especially from the workshops. And so we're going to get a real taste of that this morning. And indeed, we're very, very privileged to do so. For today, I would ask, in terms of maximizing the experience, if you can put your Zoom into the speaker view. For most folks, that's in the upper left-hand corner. And that way it'll give you a better view of the speaker as we go forward. I ask that think about questions, because after we're going to have some time for Q&A, but the questions, I'm going to ask you to put the questions when we get to that point into the chat. And through the chat, we'll be monitoring that, and then I'll be relaying your questions as we go forward. Before we introduce our speaker, I did want to recognize and invite to say a hello, Gary Jones from the Jewish Federation of Western Connecticut, our partner on our campus and our partner in many things, including Israel advocacy. Gary?
So very briefly, thank you very much for including us. It's always a treasure to work with you, Rabbi, and the congregation, and of course the Israel Advocacy Committee in producing really important programs to highlight the importance of the U.S. relationship with Israel. Ben, it's really nice to see you again. We go back a number of years now. I know this program is going to be terrific, and we can never emphasize enough how important it is that the United States and Israel continue to have good relationships. It's important for Israel, it's important for Jews in our country, it's important for Jews from around the world, and as this program will demonstrate, it's also important for the United States. So thank you so much for giving me this quick opportunity to say hello.
Thank you, Gary. And to introduce our speaker is the chair of our Israel Advocacy Committee at B'nai Israel, Hadar Lubin.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I know I'm sitting among friends, but nonetheless, I'll introduce myself. In addition of being the chair of the Israel Advocacy Committee, I'm also a dual citizen of Israel and the United States. As a fourth-generation Israeli and a proud Jew, I care tremendously that Israel will continue to be a safe haven for Jews. And as an American, I equally care that our interest in a safe, democratic, and stable Middle East will be achieved. Despite Israel's amazing achievements in the past 73 years, its existence and safety is dependent on political, diplomatic, and security assistance from the outside. The only country that has the strength, the power, and the will to commit to this assistance is the United States. This strong bond between America and Israel cannot ever be taken for granted. As we know, it was not always like that. AIPAC is a bipartisan organization that advocates for a strong US-Israel relationship and makes sure that this partnership, no matter which party is in the White House, is always strong and always growing. I attended my first AIPAC policy conference 16 years ago, did not miss one since, where I witnessed exactly that, a bipartisan approach that not only impacts Israel's security, but improves the world. Today, I have the pleasure to introduce to all of you Anya Krivin, who is the AIPAC's Assistant Director for Policy and Government Affairs. With expertise in cybersecurity and other 21st century challenges, Anya works with members of Congress to promote government-to-government partnerships that also engage the private sector and further American-Israeli cooperation, benefiting our world. Prior to AIPAC, Anya was the Director of Congressional Affairs for the DC office of Israel Allies Foundation and served as a Middle East Fellow on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Anya holds a bachelor's degree in broadcast journalism and a master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies. I'm very pleased to welcome you, Anya.
Thank you, Hadar, for that warm introduction. And Rabbi, thank you for hosting this event. And more than that, it's wonderful to hear that you have an Israel Advocacy Committee at your shul. I commend you. And I thank you all for being here today. It's really an honor to speak before you. So why are we here? I want to talk about what the US and Israel are doing together in the non-defense space, okay? And why it's so important. And this is such a broad topic. And as I'm looking at this room, I'm realizing, and also whenever I come to speak to a shul, I know that I'm going to meet with people who might have more knowledge on me on some of these issues. Like every now and then I go to speak about cyber, and then someone raises his hand and he's been working at Qualcomm or a leading cyber defense startup for years. So that's always nice and an opportunity to learn. And please do use Q&A as a chance to speak or bounce some ideas off. I'm always happy to listen. So I like to start my presentations with a story. I think it helps. And I often find myself talking about my grandparents. So I'm going to do that again today. And I'm going to tell you about my grandmother. She was born in 1925 in London. And as soon as she was old enough, she joined the World War II efforts. She joined the Wrens, which is the Royal Navy Services, and the Women's Royal Navy Services. And she ended up serving at Bletchley Park. Now, if some of you all may be history buffs or might have read some good books or movies, but you'll know that Bletchley Park was the facility where they broke the Enigma code, the German code that was seemingly unbreakable. It had millions upon millions of permutations for every single message it transmitted, but the code was broken there by, in no small part, due to the genius of Alan Turing. So it's a fascinating story, and my grandmother never told us that she worked there until it became public, which wasn't until decades later. And her and my aunt took a trip to Bletchley Park, and it was this really amazing moment for my family. And my grandmother finally opened up. So why do I bring this up? It was because of the efforts of a mathematician, scientist who worked on that project that the Allies, that the UK and then the Allies broke the code, the Enigma code, and it was in no small part because of that code breaking that the Allies won World War II. And if I look at it, it's really two pieces. It was the genius of the code breakers, the scientists, the mathematicians, and then how that information was used by Allies to win the war, right? And it was as much of that effort as the battles that were fought on the beaches of Normandy that we prevailed. So I start with that story. And I'll come back to it. So let's fast forward 1948, US recognition of Israel. And although the US was the first country to recognize Israel, it only took a matter of minutes. There wasn't a lot of strategic cooperation in the beginning, right? That developed, especially within the context of the Cold War, and as the regional dynamics were changing, and then the US-Israel relationship was really born. But in the interim, and as all that was happening, there was this amazing thing happening in Israel, right? You had this new country, and there was no water. There wasn't enough water. The majority of the country was non-arable land. There were no natural resources, and there was no regional commerce, right? Israel was not doing a ton of trade with Syria, Lebanon, or Egypt in those years. So here you have this tough situation. And in these years, in these interim years, Israel becomes the leader in agricultural technology, right? The drip irrigation that's changing agriculture all over the world today. Israel exports its drip irrigation all over the world. It becomes a leader in water desalination. It revolutionizes the way that people can use ocean water to be drinkable water. It also became a leader in disaster relief. It led not only in desalination of water, but also using sewage water or gray water for their agriculture. Israel uses more of their sewage or wastewater than any other country in the world. And also energy. I mean, Israel led in some of the solar technology and sustainable and renewable energies and energy storage. So here you have this tiny country, right? There's been books written about this. I don't need to go through, but just to give you a sense, in this time when there was very little strategic cooperation, or maybe it was just growing between the US and Israel, Israel was developing its own startup ecology, its own startup country and leadership. So there was in that period some US-Israel coordination. There were some binational foundations that we are still involved with today, and AIPAC was involved with getting some of these off the ground. Some of them, they may be familiar to you, BIRD, which stands for the Binational Industrial Research and Development Foundation. You have BARD, which does similar stuff, but in agriculture. It's called the Binational Agricultural Research and Development Foundation, and BSF, the Binational Science Foundation, right? So these are government institutions that AIPAC helped stand up decades ago, that still exist, and they were very effective. At Startup Nation, at one point, 60% of all of Israel's startups in the sciences that were on the NASDAQ began with funding from BIRD, right? So these were relevant organizations, but it was a little bit ad hoc. It wasn't the focus of the US-Israel relationship, and it certainly wasn't AIPAC's focus, although we were involved. Now all that has changed, okay? In 2014, AIPAC worked hard, members of Congress, it was Ileana Ros-Lehtinen and Ted Deutsch, for those of you that follow, who led this initiative called the Strategic Partnership Act. And this was a broad piece of legislation that was a broad authorization for more cooperation in some of the fields I've mentioned: energy, water, cyber. And the intention of this legislation, the way we saw it, was trying to create an interstate highway where only country roads had existed between them. So trying to figure out, how do we elevate this cooperation between the US and Israel? And that was followed up by another bill that eventually passed just last year. It was something we worked on for a while, that many of you may have lobbied on, that further expanded the cooperation into the field of health, agriculture, and space, among others. So here you have a big pot of lots of different areas that the US and Israel should work together. And we can talk a little bit about how that's happening, but I think before we do that, I want to emphasize why it's so important right now. There is a great power competition happening right now. China is on the rise, and it has a strategic plan, which is public. This is not classified information. They have this strategic plan for global economic domination through two initiatives that are sort of work hand in hand. One is the Belt and Road Initiative, where China is going into the world and building ports, transportation infrastructure, and other roads, bridges, etc., in all over the world. By the way, China owns and operates ports in the US. not to mention their reach in the Middle East and especially Africa and the developing world. They're very aggressive. So you have this Belt and Road Initiative. You also have the Digital Silk Road Initiative, and this kind of goes into my area. I focus on cyber, as Hadar mentioned, where in conjunction with the physical infrastructure, they are building this cyber infrastructure, this digital infrastructure, which is communications infrastructure. And we can get more into that, but the word Huawei might have come up in some of it. If you're reading the international newspapers, Huawei is considered to be it's their big telecommunications firm. It's government owned, government operated, and it potentially poses this huge threat as China builds out their infrastructure for 5G, and potentially will take the keys to this digital communication in the future, global digital communication in the future. So the bad news is China is succeeding. Okay, they have this. They have this size. They have this. Given the fact that they are less than a democracy, they have a much more stability in their government. They can publish a plan in 2000, and in 2020 they have the same leadership echelon of leadership that is able to carry it out. Right, that is something that's inherently gives us a disadvantage as the democracy. Whereas no one would argue that that is a better form of leadership, it does give them an inherent edge on us for being able to sort of carry out these strategies over decades. I've mentioned their size. I've mentioned the government control, and in essence, there is essentially no private sector. The government has its fingers in everything in China. So this gives them the edge. In the last decade, the U.S. has finally woken up to this. If you all will remember Obama's pivot to Asia. Unfortunately, he got mired down in the events of his presidency. Not to mention ISIS and all that was going on in Afghanistan and Iraq. But Biden has come in with a totally with a commitment to facing this challenge. And Obama talked about the pivot to Asia. Biden's come in and is frontally facing Asia. All of his foreign policy goals lead with talking about China. And we think that we're headed for a presidency that will be very focused on that. So that's the good news. Another issue that is relevant, and this is just one of many. There are many we can talk about. I'm going to focus on China and another issue today. The other issue is climate change, and this is another issue that Obama began to talk about, and the Biden administration has really taken the bull by the horns in climate change. And the issue of climate change and countering climate change is really filtering into many, many aspects of foreign policy already. I mean, I talked to a friend over at USAID the other day, and he said that he's already seeing it in their policy directives. A really big turn to this issue. This is another area where Israel could be extremely helpful to the US. I've mentioned ag tech, I've mentioned all of their leadership in these innovations with cyber. I've mentioned AI, right? Artificial intelligence, which is definitely going to be one of the keys to the future. And Israel has been singled out as a partner by the administration. There've been just a flood of articles in the past couple of months that have been going around, and it has this group of nations. Biden has coined the term techno-democracies that can work together to face this challenge of not only China but also climate change. And again, there are others. I'm going to glaze over them a little bit just in the interest of time. But those are two that I think are extremely relevant. And by the way, we just to enter a new idea into the fray, the Abraham Accords. Why the Abraham Accords? Why now? It's because countries like the UAE and Bahrain, and hopefully later down the line, others will join. There's talk about Saudi Arabia, there's talk about some other countries, but what they've seen, and this is something, again, that's public, this is not intelligence, this is not classified. What they've seen is that Israel has created an economy with very little resources. Like I said, we all know they came into this land and there were no natural resources. There wasn't even water. And here they are with this incredible ecology of startup and this culture of innovation. And a country like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain see this and they think, we need this, right? We are facing the same challenges that the rest of the world are. Granted, they have a lot of oil, they have a huge sovereign wealth fund, they have many, many, many things going for them, but this won't last forever. It's not a sustainable way of leading a country. So seeing how Israel has succeeded, and especially given all these things that we've talked about, all these challenges and opportunities that we all face in this moment, it sees Israel as a partner. And I think that it was a huge motivator for these Abraham Accords. So I'm going to close all this up, and what I'm going to suggest to you is that the battles of the future, right, and the climate change great race, there's just a couple of them, these won't be won on the battlefield. These crises, these conflicts, we're going to have to think our way out of these ones. And that is like a really important thing to understand right now, and it's an important dynamic. And I think if you're looking for a reason of why all this is happening now, why the strategic partnership, why is it so critical at this moment, you have to look at these big phenomenon that are happening around us. And just like in World War II, and perhaps much more today, we're going to have to work with our allies and garner all of our resources to deal with these major national security and climate, right, and problems that are upon us, and they are upon us. These are real, and they're happening now. But the good news is the Biden administration is in there, and the U.S. has experience doing this. We have experience working with allies to defeat these major challenges, and we are well on the way to doing it now. So I'm gonna stop there. And open it up for questions. I am a cyber nerd, and it's the part of the non-defense portfolio that I work on at APAC. So we can talk a little bit about that. If you all want to dive into the Abraham Accords, if there's something really, I'm here for your questions. So please, you can. I think Rabbi is going to manage that for me.
Yes, and thank you for such wonderful and well-framed information. And we've all already gotten a taste of one of the things which is always, as I mentioned earlier, so striking, which is that we're getting well-timed information, which is not what's presented in the media. If this does not really come out there, but it really it synthesizes so many important things. Our first question is if you can expand on how will China's rise affect the U.S.-Israel relationship as you're seeing things going? Sure.
So I think that the rise of China, if you want to look for a silver lining, I think this would be one of them. And it's, as I've kind of laid out, it's really, the U.S. is going to have to work with allies, and Israel is chief among them. I've read a couple papers recently that have sort of formulated these groupings of allies, and including sort of our traditional Western European allies, including Italy and Finland and Norway, who are also, punch above their weight in innovation and technology. And Israel's been included in most of them. So I think that if there was a silver lining to the rise of China, from our perspective, sitting in America, it was that there'll be more innovation, and it's going to be a forcing mechanism for the U.S. to go out there and do the hard work and get ahead of this, and I think we will. There are other, it's an interesting dilemma from Israel, right? This isn't the question, but this is something interesting to think about, because Israel does not see China as the kind of threat that we do in the U.S. And you have some recent incidents where the U.S. and Israel are balancing this, right? The U.S. and Israel cannot afford to lose the support and mutually beneficial relationship that the U.S.-Israel ties provide. So, and Israel, and the U.S. has come down on Israel recently on a couple of incidents, specifically on a port. Interesting enough, because we talked about ports, right? Israel put out requests for proposals for building and maintenance of one of its major ports in Haifa. and it put the request out, and China came in as the most competitive, and Israel sealed the deal and signed that agreement with China, and the U.S. came in and said, oh, no, you don't. That is not a good idea. We can't have our sixth fleet coming into that port. This isn't going to work. And Israel had to walk that back, and they did, because they understand this equation, right? It is not complicated for Israel, and AIPAC was kind of in the middle of that, right? It was government to government. We didn't play a huge role, but we were fielding a lot of those questions from the Hill. What does Israel think it's doing? Signing and to have this Chinese port in Haifa, when that's where this is putting our intelligence at risk, et cetera, et cetera. And although it kind of came out of the blue, and Israel, in many ways, hadn't anticipated this kind of reaction from the U.S., it did the right thing. Another example of this, which is particularly interesting and relevant, is we talked a little bit about the digital Silken Road, right? About China and their project to put in communications infrastructure throughout the world. A big component of this is 5G. Huawei is a leader in 5G, where the U.S., Israel, and allied nations are grappling with that right now. It's not going to be very straightforward. But Israel was one of the first allied nations when America kind of put its foot down a couple years ago and started doing the tour of allies, saying, we don't want you to take China's 5G. We don't want you to have this infrastructure in your country. It's not safe. It's not safe for our intel. It's not safe for your intel. Don't do it. They got mixed responses. They got mixed responses from the UK. They got mixed responses from other allied nations. And Israel said, yes, we're not going to put Huawei in our systems. So the rise of China and this phenomenon in our lifetime, my lifetime, and how it plays out in my children's lives, is really largely being decided today. And so far, I think that the U.S. has been pleased with the response it's received from Israel. And I think, I'm not inside the heads of these decision makers, but if I had to guess, I would say that's why Israel is being considered in all of these groupings of techno-democracies that are going to work on these critical technologies. I think it's because it's proved that there's a fidelity to the U.S. and a lot of value added that Israel brings to the table.
Questions are coming in. What will Biden's biggest challenges be regarding American-Israel relations?
Oh, that's a great question. What will Biden's biggest challenges be? Well, I mean, if I'm looking at this through the lens of this conversation, I don't see a ton of, like, you could talk about, there's a spectrum of things we could talk about, right? We could talk about what's going in Israel. We could talk about Israeli domestic politics, which is sticky. There's a lot of things we could talk about. I would really like to focus on what we're talking about today, just because otherwise we could run the gamut of and get into all kinds of rabbit holes.
Well,
I only see, yeah.
Well, I was, and as a part of that, I see. Will Biden support the expansion of the Abraham Accords?
Okay, that kind of focuses us a little bit. Yes, yeah. Biden didn't talk much about foreign policy on the campaign trail as he campaigned for president. But one of the first and the most strident speeches he gave, press releases, however you want to phrase it, was on the Abraham Accords. He is supportive of the Abraham Accords. And all of what we're hearing from his administration has left the door wide open to solidify the Abraham Accords and potentially to expand them, which is very good news for us. And I'll also give you a little teaser. AIPAC is working on something too with Congress. As you know, AIPAC focuses on Congress. That is absolutely where we feel that we have the most strength, largely because of our activists like you all who come and lobby them and speak with them on the behalf of the U.S.-Israel relationship. And we're working on something right now, so stay tuned. Make sure you're signed up for our emails. But yes, the Biden administration will be supportive and Congress is supportive.
And the Biden administration's outreach to Iran, will that help? Will that hinder our relationship with Israel?
So that will pose some challenges. But from everything that we've understood from the Biden administration, and this is a situation that's evolving very, very quickly. This is not Obama 2.0, at least not in this department. The Biden administration recognizes that we're not where we were in 2015. The situation on the ground has changed considerably. And the Biden administration has laid out two very specific requirements for Iran before going back into the JCPOA, the big Iran deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, but they must come into compliance. And that is a very strong word, because Iran is so far out of compliance right now not just by the JCPOA, by the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There's uranium that's been discovered that they can't explain in 4 sites. The IAEA has some major concerns right now. So just by the Biden administration, although we know they're keen to return to negotiations, right, which Israel and AIPAC have always been in favor of a stronger deal that lasts longer, right? In this department, we're on the same page with the Biden administration. Pro-diplomacy, robust diplomacy. We think that is a positive direction. But the Biden administration insistence on compliance is something that we agree strongly with, and it gives us a lot of hope that we are going to continue to to be on the same page with them, because we are so far from compliance right now that it doesn't leave much opportunity for movement at this moment. There's a lot that needs to be figured out beforehand. So I'm hopeful. I think that, again, this is a new administration, and I think that ultimately we're on the same page. We want a better, stronger deal, and we want to see compliance before we go into anything.
We have 2 additional questions related to China. The first is, will diplomatic relations with China get more friendly at the highest levels? And let me give you the second as well, which is, can you tell us about ongoing efforts on part of foreign nations, including China, to use cyber technology against us?
Okay, diplomatic relations with China and cyber. So it's a good question about diplomatic relations with China at the highest level. I try and focus on China as it relates to Israel, right? I don't know what's going to happen with China. I wish I had a crystal ball. It seems, I hope we're not on a collision course. There are a lot of issues there, but Biden administration is committed to diplomacy. That was the big campaign message that they campaigned on, their return to diplomacy. And I think that these are not the diplomatic relations are important, and these are not conflicts. These are not this isn't tension that can be resolved through direct conflict. This is tension that can be resolved through America and working with our allies to just be ahead of the curve. So I hope the diplomatic relations at the highest level between U.S. and Israel, between the U.S. and China, remain friendly, because this particular crisis is not going to be resolved through the direct conflict or even through diplomatic pressure. It has to be resolved by us putting their nose to the grindstone and working with allies to get ahead of this.
And on the cyber side?
Oh, yes, sorry. On the cyber side, thank you. Thanks for the reminder. So, a lot of what happens in cyber happens below the surface. So I don't have a full picture of what's going on. I do hear rumors of China and Russia cozying up together. We know that that Russia's focus with cyber has been mainly disruptive and misinformation campaigns. China's focus seems to be on IP theft, intellectual property theft. So these are very different challenges, but the one thing they have in common is that they would both love to replace us or at least be in direct competition with us for superpower status. So they do have a nice dovetail of purpose there, but I don't know what's happening at the highest levels. I wish I did, but again, and this is why this portfolio is so critical right now. The only way out of this for the US and her allies is to work with the techno-democracies to get ahead of it. There's very little, unfortunately, that we can do to prevent China and Russia and North Korea and all of these actors, not to mention the non-state actors, right? Hezbollah and others who have carried out some significant attacks on Israel in the past year or so. There's really, the best way to combat them is just to work to advance our own technology and our own capabilities. Look, I also don't want to make it sound like we're on our back foot. While China has a very, very sophisticated plan for economic domination, right? And I think that's something that we should all be concerned about. The NSA is still the number one organization in the world for what it does. And I said I threatened you that I might talk a little bit more about cyber, but maybe this is a nice segue to do that. So I talked about the US and the UK's working together to fight the Enigma and to ultimately use that information to take on the Nazis, and to ultimately win World War II. What's interesting about that and how it all kind of comes back to what we're talking about now is that after that collaboration on the Enigma, the US and the UK signed an agreement, and it was called UK-USA Eyes Only. It was the first sort of major signals intelligence alliance. And what is signals intelligence? Great question. Signals intelligence is gathering intelligence through listening in on communications, right? So by forming that alliance to do this kind of collection of intelligence together, to trust each other to that level, it was called UK-USA Eyes Only. That expanded into Five Eyes. Now, if you're nerdy like me, or if you read some of these some of these sort of cyber stories in the international section of these newspapers, you may have come across the phrase Five Eyes. Five Eyes is the unique and foremost intelligence alliance in the world. It's UK, USA, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And these allies work together on signals intelligence, on sort of gathering intelligence from communications, and they work together. And this is a good thing, right? If you want to have 5 countries who are sifting through thousands and thousands and thousands and millions of communications to try and find the bad guys, you want it to be these countries. What you don't want it to be is China, Russia, North Korea, Hezbollah, and other bad actors that potentially you don't want having that information. So there's a lot of question, there's a lot of controversy swirling around privacy. I understand that conversation, but let's just put it this way: if my stuff is being listened to, let it be the Five Eyes, and let it not be North Korea and China. So we talked about the Five Eyes. That is an agreement that is an alliance that was basically formed on the heels of winning World War II as a result of cracking the code of Enigma and the cooperation between the US and the UK on that intelligence project. And today this is the leading alliance that the NSA works with to try and make sure that our country remains safe and that we are meeting these challenges. I can't stress how relevant the threat from Huawei is, how relevant the threat, because because the reason that those Five Eyes are who they are is because the old technology, the old signals technology, the old communications, the cables that were built underwater between to transfer messages all over the world ended up in being in those 5 countries largely because of location, right? They all stand on these different edges of the sea, and a lot of the physical messages goes through those countries. If you send a message on your iPhone, it doesn't go like the crow flies from your phone to your grandma's phone across the ocean, or your grandchild, wherever they are on the other side of the country. It actually travels over physical infrastructure. So who owns that infrastructure and who is monitoring that infrastructure is incredibly important. So keeping the focus and these lines of communication managed, overseen, regulated by democracies where there is at least some accountability, at least some checks and balances, is so critical. And what this 5G and Huawei project of China threatens to do is shift that. And this shift would be so consequential. And that is a big reason why the U.S. is focused on this issue right now.
We've had, as you've been speaking, a number of related questions which have come in. I'm going to try to put a few of them sort of together and of these various aspects. As an example, given the rise of China and Russia, what are things that the U.S. can make sure that Israel stays in our orbit? Similarly, is there room for a sixth eye with Israel? In terms of, again, this threat of China, does Israel view Blinken and Campbell as positive choices in confronting China? As we can see, there's a lot of relationships of these pieces. So let me just stop there for one moment and
okay. So it sounds like, there's a lot of interest in what's going on with China, and I get that, and I wish that I was a China expert, and I wish that I knew I could see into the future of how the Biden administration will handle China. We have indications, but I just don't know the details. As far as Israel, APAC continues to work on strengthening and deepening the relationship between the U.S. and Israel when it comes to cyber. So that is my main charge. I work in the whole non-defense space, working on projects trying to support and bolster existing bilateral cooperation with the U.S. and Israel. I could tell you some of the successes we've had in the past few years, but I'm specifically focused in cyber, and we have a couple programs that we're looking to beef up that would allow for more expanded cooperation between U.S. and Israel, that would strengthen the grant programs and allow some of these cyber firms to enter into this space a little bit. But really, it's happening organically. I mean, Israel has demonstrated such ability to lead in this. And again, this is a country that is 70 plus years old. This is a country that's tiny, that doesn't have $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund like the UAE, and it punches way above its weight. And this is indisputable. So there's a lot that we could do collectively to sort of broaden and deepen the ability for U.S. and Israeli companies to come together and spark innovation. But a lot of it is happening organically, and Israel is a natural partner, right? This isn't like the strength of APAC hasn't magically made this happen, right? Israel and its ability speak for itself. So while we continue to find opportunities for the U.S. and Israel to work together, the marriage is happening, and it's real. And our job is really just to facilitate that and to make sure that that there's plenty of opportunities and plenty of government to government and agency to agency relationships to make it happen.
What about confrontation in space?
So this is getting a little bit outside of what of my understanding. Again, I come to this from the perspective of what can our team do to create the opportunities for work together, for U.S. and Israel to work together further. But space is definitely one of the frontiers that's next, and a lot of, you know, a couple of the things that we've worked on in the past have mentioned space, cooperation in space. We know that the U.S. is investing resources into this arena, but it's just a little bit outside of what I can talk about.
This also might be, but from what you're hearing, how does Israel view our new United States ambassador?
So, you know, as far as how Israel is perceiving the Biden administration and the appointees, you know, broadly, Biden is not really surprised. It's not really surprised us. I mean, there have been a couple of things that have come up that we weren't that Israel has sort of blinked at, but largely this is very much as expected. And I don't know that there's going to be. Biden has a long history working with AIPAC, with Israel. We know who he is. There really haven't been any surprises, and I expect it to continue like that. I mean, AIPAC is watching all of these appointments unfold, and they're people we know largely. They're people we've worked with in the past. The people that we have some history with. I mean, that would probably be a big. A stark difference between the last administration, right? Some would argue the last administration was very good for Israel, but they were not. There were a lot of surprises. There were a lot of untraditional moves, and what we're looking at with this administration is more kind of what we're used to, and a lot of the people that we've known for years. So I don't want to comment. I mean, I don't know personally how Israel feels about this appointment or another, and I don't know that AIPAC has a position on that, but I will say that it's more business as usual, and there haven't been a ton of surprises, and I think this is a good thing for stability and for continuity of policy, and in many ways.
Sort of heading back just slightly, earlier you mentioned the natural development of Israel's innovation ecology. Can you talk about what AIPAC has done to foster the development and to formalize how our countries are working together? And
so that's a really good question.
Water, energy, cyber.
Yeah, this really gets into the nuts and bolts of what I do, and I'm glad you asked. So the short answer is we do a lot, and we've been involved in this from the beginning since the 80s and before. I mentioned there are 3 binational programs, so that's a good place to start, right? And these are all things that you can search on the internet. They're pretty user friendly. There's BIRD, which is the Binational Industrial Research and Development Foundation. This was an endowment that was set up, and my colleague, who you may have had some interaction with before or gone to her event at Policy Columns, Esther Kurz, was actually on staff when a lot of these were established, and she can talk about them. From the memory of how they were established. It's really quite amazing. So we've been involved from the beginning. There's BIRD, the Binational Industrial Research and Development. There's BARD, the Binational Agricultural Research and Development, and there's the Binational Science Foundation. And for years, all of these ran on a shoestring. In the last couple of years, since, I mentioned that with all these sort of global phenomenon happen, AIPAC kind of got hip to that, and they built a team around it. So it's not just me, it's me and a colleague, and we have a whole communications strategy and and some brains that actually think about this around the clock. How can we improve this? And we've started filling in some of those gaps. So Congress, how does Congress help? Congress holds the purse strings. We've worked to make sure that these foundations and these programs are funded, and not only that, but we've thought of some innovative ways that Congress can kind of weigh in. So you have these binational programs. They have a broad sort of set of goals to achieve. In one instance, my colleague worked on this. My colleague Michael Fleischman worked on this. He went to Congress and he said, "Look, we have this amazing mechanism. We have this mechanism where you can work with Israel. This is a country that, you know, we can go through the list of achievements it's made, the Nobel Prizes, right? The sheer volume of venture capital, the amount of companies that are listed on the NASDAQ. This is a country that invests more than any other country in research and development. We can bring a partnership with American companies, and we just need this umbrella. So we provided these umbrella with these three foundations, and Michael, my colleague, who was involved in significantly increasing those, went to Congress and it's like, look, we have this great program. What are you interested in? You know, Congressman X, Senator Y, what are you interested in? What are your priorities? And Congress weighed in and said, we want to focus on energy. We want to focus on energy storage. We want to focus on cybersecurity for civilian infrastructure, right? This is another very hot topic. There have been some very high profile attacks on Israel's water infrastructure, on our water infrastructure. And I say attacks, right? There are hundreds of attempted attacks a day. These are successful. These are ones where they actually managed to break through and got pretty close to having some disastrous effects, right? So so cybersecurity for critical infrastructure, let's focus on that. So Congress can actually zoom in, and under the umbrella of these mechanisms that we helped create some decades ago, they can infuse money into specific areas of interest. And this is a really powerful tool. And the model that exists in these foundations is that Israel matches. So Congress puts in money, Israel matches the money, and then often the private sector comes in and matches it again, tripling the effect of the funding. So these are things, that structures that have existed for a long time. What APEX put a lot of thought into is how to expand them to meet the challenges and opportunities of today, and with real success. I mean, with real success and being able to sort of zoom in and focus on what the need is, especially from the U.S. side, especially when we can get Congress to weigh in very specifically to what it's looking for.
Let's see, Anand, could you please operationalize energy storage?
Operationalize energy storage. What is operationalize energy storage?
Yeah, you know what, I guess
maybe define energy storage.
What is that? I guess the question was, you had said, what does that mean? Was
Got
the
it. Okay.
question.
So this is a great question. My dad lives in Israel. He lives on a little village. He calls it a village in the middle of the desert called Sde Boker. If you've been to Israel, it's where Ben Gurion was buried. It's not the kibbutz, it's the midrasha. I see you nodding. On the midrasha, they did a lot of solar research on my dad's midrasha. You can walk out into the desert and see these massive solar, I don't know what to even call them. They're like these half domes, right? Facing out to the sun. They pivot with the sun. This has been going on for decades there. And they had researchers from Australia coming and living on the midrasha for years to try and figure this out, harnessing the sun, right? And they did it very successfully. The problem wasn't harnessing the sun, right? You can get so much sun, not just where my dad lives in Israel, but all over the world, Australia, the US, my roof in Baltimore, Maryland, right? The problem is storing it. How do you store this energy in a way that you can continue to use it over a long period of time, right? So energy storage is a real important question as we make a move to clean energy and solar energy and other forms of energy. It's also, by the way, was a big challenge in coming up with an effective electric car. Those batteries that store enough energy to take those $180,000 Tesla cars from A to B were sort of one of the main driving costs in developing the car. How do you store that much energy in something the size of the bonnet of a car? So energy storage, not just capturing it, but maintaining it and holding on to it in a way that lasts, has been a conundrum in the move to clean energy. I mean, we're much further along than we were, but we also have a long way to go. And Israel has, because of its lack of energy, its lack of indigenous and energy, has been very focused on that. And there have been some very, very exciting developments out of institutes in Israel. So when I say energy storage, I'm talking about the shift away from traditional fuel, and finding a way to harness, to hold on to it in a way that's sustainable and that might one day be more effective than the options we have today.
In what little time we have, turning back to APAC, some questions about what APAC is doing to counter the partisanship that has arisen in Congress around Israel policy. What are APAC's sort of most urgent goals looking to this coming year?
Yeah, so those are really good questions, and I think this is a great way to a great question to end on. So I mentioned earlier, stay tuned. We are dropping our legislative package for the year on March 15th. So I hope that's in 8 days time, which is amazing, 8 days time. So so stay tuned. We are going to do, our legislative package always has similar themes, right? Aid is an extremely important issue. The aid that goes to Israel, the security, it's not really aid, it's security assistance, goes to Israel is critical. And there have been some, in the past couple of years, there have been some rumblings on the far left about qualifying aid, putting additional qualifiers on the aid we send. So aid is always one of them, and that's something that will continue to be. Iran, right? You talk about partisanship. Iran is a tough place to find partisan agreement, but there is a way to do it. And that is what APAC's goal, I think, is definitely for the first quarter of this year, is to find that path. And believe me, it's not straightforward, but we're the only organization that's going to be able to do that. So you talk about the value of APAC, you talk about what we bring to the table. This is it. If there is a way to find bipartisanship in Congress around this issue, we are going to have to figure that lane out. There's no other organization out there that can do it, and we think we have a path. We think we have a path, and we're going to continue to broaden that. Finally, just again giving you a teaser of what's to come. We think that a really great bipartisan issue is normalization, right? It's everything we just talked about. It's the non-defense portfolio that is going to catapult America into the next phase, right? Into the next century, into this great race. And this is not a race, by the way, this is not a race we can lose. Talk about the great race, this very abstract thing. We can't lose this race. This is not a conflict that's going to be fought on the battlefield, but this is a conflict that needs our full attention. And Israel is going to be one of the partners that does that. And this is an issue that gains a lot of bipartisan consensus. And someone asked me earlier on the call what the Biden administration's stance was for the Abraham Accords. The short answer is positive. They want to support this. They understand that this is an important alliance. Right? Peace is good. A rising tide lifts all ships. And there is a lot of consensus around this issue, right? So if you ask or focus on, it's going to be continuing the hugely mutually beneficial U.S.-Israel relationship with the security aid. It's going to be trying to find that lane on Iran, which again is only we can do, and we're going to find a way to do it. And finally, making sure that this really incredible development from the past couple of years finds its legs. We don't want this. There have been normalization attempts in the past. Those with the longer memory than me might even remember them. They fizzled and failed. We don't want this to happen. We want this normalization to continue. We want it to expand, and we want it to really lead to a new era in the Middle East, and we think it can.
Well, thank you. What a hopeful note, and thank you so much for your expertise this morning. And let us also recognize Ben Marchette from APAC, who is also joining us on the call. Very grateful I thank everyone in our community for the wonderful questions that were asked. And I believe we got to the majority of them. The hour just sort of very quickly went, which is a sign of very thoughtful discourse. So we're so grateful to that, and I thank David Johnson in particular for his work in going through the chat and questions, and we're very grateful, David, to you for that. So let me wish everybody a very good day. Anya, thank you again, and to APAC and Gary. We thank Federation, our co-sponsor here, and we look forward to seeing everybody soon. And we look forward to joining you all in APAC down in DC. Hopefully 2022 will be a return to DC. Bimhira v'yameinu, speedily and in our days. So thanks again, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.